Thank you so much for having me. I am going to talk about an island, and it is true, I run an island. I'm not joking. That's what I said to the cab driver who took me from the airport. I realized I should come up with another story about what I do, because it really is a conversation stopper. This is Govs Island. Govs Island is, as John said, 172 acres. It's about a 5-minute boat ride from the financial district, which you can see off in the distance, and about half that from Brooklyn. It's a former military base, so I grew up in New York. I'd never heard of it, really until the mayor asked me to run it. And at the moment, we're in the middle of a design process and actually construction process to build a park. You can see this is the site plan designed by an extraordinary landscape architecture firm called West8, based in Rotterdam, working with a number of American architects. And it's won a lot of awards. Here's a few of the awards that the design has won, but that's actually not what I'm going to talk to you about. I'm going to talk to you about a sign. Pretty simple sign. And that's not a pun, sign, design. This is really going to be about making this relevant to what this day is about, which is innovation and transformation in healthcare. So it's not just everyone's filled with popcorn and this is a break from much more substantive issues, but Bill Drentel had the idea when I taught a class for him at Yale that talking about our design process would actually have larger relevance. So I had kind of the same reaction that the cab driver did when Bill called me up and said, would you like to come to the Mayo Clinic? And I said, are you sure? Like, you have the right person? But I'm going to talk about how we do design in the park on Govs Island. So we tried to do a sketch, and one of the things, I have a background in high tech, but my PowerPoint knowledge stopped in about 1996 when I left Microsoft. So I really couldn't create our design process as complex as it actually is. So design is much messier in our design process by intent than this would lead you to believe. But the first thing in our design process is actually knowing your users. Now that sounds really obvious. But it is not so obvious. I think many designers actually don't necessarily know who they're designing for or how to prioritize which users matter more or what their users really need. The second part in our design process is articulating clear goals. And it's not going to come as a surprise to you that actually both of those precepts came to me from working at Microsoft. So I was at Microsoft in the era when we opened our first usability lab. I ran a software development team with no background in technology. But the other thing that I learned at Microsoft was it was all about the plan and the brief. And it was our job, first in marketing and then in running products, to really be able to articulate what are the goals before people started coding features. But one of the things actually that they didn't do so well at Microsoft back in those days, but is an important rule on Govs Island, is if you're designing for humans, speak like one. It actually also helps if you write like a human as well. Now, I understand I'm in a healthcare forum, so I'm sure that this has been a topic, and medical professionals earlier today already shared what their experience was when they were on the other side. But there's a whole set of lingo and jargon in every professional ghetto, for lack of a better term, and it certainly exists in the design world as well. So here's some of the favorite phrases that are now banned on Govs Island. Does anyone know what a desire line is? No. A desire line, only landscape architects speak that. That actually translation is, where do you want to go? So you're designing something, where do I want to go? That's where I desire to go. Biomorphic, another aspirational word, I believe is actually free-form shapes. A foot candle, my favorite. So we have a brilliant lighting designer who's doing the lighting for our park. She can tell me how many foot candles it is. I have no idea what a foot candle is. So that word has been banned as well. And instead we have conversations about, will it feel safe at night to walk on this path? Is there enough light that I will feel safe? This is incredibly important because one of the things that I find is once you start using language that doesn't map back to users and user experience, you've already lost half the battle. So one of the favorite words, and I'm not sure if it's used in healthcare, but it's used in a lot of nonprofits around the country, is engagement. How are we going to engage people? And I've told people that unless they have a new ring on a certain finger, engagement is a word that's banned on Govs Island. Because again, nobody says I want to go to the parental engagement office, except the director of that office at the Department of Education. Parents want to be involved in their kids' education. So language is incredibly important. The second rule, and this is all before we start designing, is if you're designing for humans, actually act like one. And that means put yourself in your user's shoes. And again, there was a great image earlier this morning, right, of a physician undergoing a colonoscopy, and we all sort of felt that pain. But in more prosaic terms, that means literally, when we're talking about design, I want to see it at what we now call it foot level. Because what architects like to do is like to show you big, beautiful renderings, whether it's of buildings or new hospitals or of parks. And usually that's kind of, in the case of parks, kind of that Mary Poppins view, right? You're floating above the park. Well, I'm not designing for birds. We're designing for people. So I want to actually see what you're looking at. I was actually at Taliesin yesterday, and I was explaining this to the dean of the architecture school. So he said, so you mean you want more cross sections? And I said, no, that's not what I mean. I mean, I want a conversation that's about what is the user going to experience? Where is there going to be shade? I had a violent debate with our architects about the height of our benches. The benches were 18 inches high. Why? Because they were. Is that comfortable? It just is the way it is. And so what I discovered is that the comfort of a backless bench, for those of us if we've passed the half-century mark, has as much to do with that little air gap when you're sitting down. Does everyone know what I'm talking about? As you're going down. And so we added an inch. So now we have truly comfortable benches because we put our butts in the place of our users when we were designing our benches. And then finally, what makes us all human is that we adapt. And what you have to do when you're in a design process is actually adapt. So that was all preamble to before we start the design process. But most design processes are linear, right? So I'm the client in this case. I'm not the designer. Designers present things, you sign off on them, you keep marching down the path. That's not what we do on Govs Island. We observe. I've carefully used the word observe, and I debated as recently as 7 o'clock this morning whether I should add the word listen. But in this election season, I think it's the first presidential campaign where we didn't see both candidates get in a bus right after the conventions to go on a listening tour. But I think the word listen has sort of become a cliche. And what we mean by observe is, yes, we listen to our users, but we actually spend much more time observing what they're doing and trying to process and discuss that. And the reason we discuss is because what I see and what you see when we're watching the same thing, especially if I'm the client and the person who runs the island and you're the designer, they may not be the same thing. So we actually have to discuss and occasionally debate what it is that we observed. But then, very importantly, what we do is we experiment. And experimenting includes putting out collapsible chairs. You saw that sign. We'll talk about that in a second. And then it means that we iterate, and then we go back to design. And of course, as I said, if I had a more elaborate PowerPoint, or we actually could afford smart boards on Govs Island, I would show you that this is a much messier process that keeps on going. But my husband likes to tell me, don't tell, show, don't tell. So I thought what I would do is I would walk you through a design process for part of the park and talk about how we applied that, actually in some ways initially failed, and then we hope came out with success. So this is Govs Island. So this is more of a foot view, as I was telling you. So this is an old military base. You can see Lower Manhattan just off in the distance, and that's actually the vessel that the Army commissioned. So this is where everybody arrives in Govs Island. And of course, it was never designed, right? It was a military base. So our notion when we decided to start with a park was that this should be a welcoming, beautiful place. And we had a master plan, and we wrote very eloquent language, and we talked about that building that you saw on the right, adapting it, concessions, healthy adaptive reuse. And at the bottom, we sort of noticed that, like, yes, we'd have to accommodate a few vehicles too, but it was really going to be this big, beautiful green welcome. And you can see there's the site plan, that sort of, not quite Mary Poppins, probably pigeon or helicopter view. And then this is what we published. So this was our master plan. We released it in 2010. It was beautiful. It was on the front page of the Times. Everybody loved it. And then reality happened. Reality came, those trucks that we sort of said, maybe we have to deal with them. There are lots of them. This morning, I probably had 30 or 40 trucks before 9 a.m. How would we accommodate the fact that vehicles were still going to come through what we were calling a park? And then, luckily, we became popular. So instead of this abandoned island, there were 8,000 visitors the summer before I started. We had 8,000 visitors yesterday. And as you can see, a lot of people are coming to Govs Island. You'll notice a lot of them are kids. A lot of them are on bicycles. And we had this vision of this great promenade wrapping around the island, and there was Swasson's Landing. And you'll notice that people on bicycles and strollers, coming off a boat and on a boat, 1,000 people at a time, potential conflict. So we decided actually to accept reality. And then as we were accepting reality, we also said we have to question some of the received wisdom about what it meant to establish this welcome space. So we threw out the master plan, right? This was a beautiful rendering done by our architects. You'll never see it built, and it was gone. So we had to go back to our design process and going back to observing and really observing in a thoughtful way. So we studied what people did, and some of these things are really obvious. People follow other people. People see shade, they go to shade. But when you're doing that in a design process, it forces you to decide what, as architects say, moves you're going to make, what I would say, what you're going to do about it when you're actually designing a space. And then we discussed that. So the received wisdom is, of course, that all parks have visitor centers, right? That's what we had in our master plan. You saw that. Here's a beautiful National Park Service visitor center. Here's a kind of ugly visitor center somewhere else. Here's a particularly glamorous one up in Boston. And then we started talking, and we said, now, why is it that you would actually want to go inside the minute that you arrive at a park? And do you actually want to start a conversation with strangers, with staff, when you're there with your family and friends? And do you really actually need to eat the minute you arrive because you've just made this long 5-minute journey from the desert, aka Manhattan? Now, the one thing we do know is you do need a bathroom. Very important. And interestingly enough, we had just built new bathrooms literally a few yards away, but our architecture team hadn't really paid attention to that because that was part of a different project. So we actually decided in this discussion, you can be visitor-centric without actually having a visitor center. And so we came up with a phrase that what we thought people wanted and needed, even though they didn't actually ask for it and they never used this phrase, was what we called a provisioning of information. You're coming to this island to relax for the day. You're going to spend 3 or 4 hours. If you can figure out what time does the boat leave, where can I pee, is there food, what's happening, you provision your information, you can go off, relax, and do what you want to do. And that notion of provisioning of information is what drove this design. This work is done by the incredible design firm Pentagram, working in collaboration with West 8. And this is what will greet you, the welcome wall at Govs Island when the park is built and it will open next fall. So that was an example where in this area, Swassons, we threw out the received wisdom. We really forced ourselves to observe. And even when we were making the presentation, I had to actually force my team to use language like, we care about bathrooms and why do I want to eat? Because they thought that wasn't professional enough to use in front of all of you. And I said, we still have to use the language. That's how people talk. And so that's what we are designing for. So we sort of had fixed one problem, but we still had this reality problem, right, of these thousands of people coming, literally 1,000 people off, 1,000 people on, bikes, somewhat chaos. So we went back to our design process again. And what we realized was we had to really know our users and actually throw out those old goals that you saw in our master plan and update them. So we had a new goal, right, because we'd thrown out the master plan, we didn't have any design anymore. And this is what I thought I said, that we would move pedestrians, cyclists, and vehicles safely off the ferry. Now, the truth is, I know that the design team heard safely, and you'll see what they spent their time doing, but I'm not sure that we were even then speaking the language. So what the design team did was they started designing, and they designed some more. And they kept on designing. And you can see these are very elaborate schemes, and there's not a lot of observing and discussion and iteration here. There's design iteration. And what we ended up with, wait, I think they kept on going. Now, if you look closely at that, you might say that looks like the I-90 overpass. It is, it's an overpass. Because what the design team heard was that we had this beautiful promenade wrapping around the island. We were all concerned about safety, And the way to sort of deal with that potential intersection was to actually create an overpass. An overpass on an island, right? So they'd be building right near the seawall. It would cost several $1 million, and it would introduce a whole lot of other problems that I won't bore you with. So I came to the realization as the client that our design process had run amok, that we were spinning our wheels and gyrating, and again, we had to go back to what we knew how to do, which was to experiment. And so I was in Central Park one day, and I saw a beautiful sign, and thank God for iPhones, right? You see a beautiful, this is what I do, I'm a geek, right? I take pictures of signs, and I came back, and I said, I'd like to have one of these signs. And there you can see me. I can't tell you how much the sign cost, but it was not several $1 million. We bought it off the shelf, and I said, let's try and just put a sign and see what happens, right? So clearly we're not going to spend $4 million on a several yard overpass. And that is me, actually. And we simulated this for this presentation, but I literally put it out myself. And you can't underestimate the importance of the CEO of an organization actually moving signs as sending a signal to the people who work in the organization that, for example, in this case, safety and experimentation matter. So I put the sign out there, and we had to keep on iterating, because that sort of worked. But we realized that actually, if you got another sign, and you sort of prepared, and again, this is logical, if you sort of set up expectations for people, guess what? They would get off their bikes. So all of a sudden, this huge conflict and these debates and these hours of design, all of a sudden, people, even New Yorkers, act like sheep when you give them the right cues. So there they are. But we had to keep on iterating because, again, when you're doing design, when you're creating spaces, you have to pay attention to every little detail in operations. So interestingly enough, those are movable signs. The trucks come, you move them to the side. Well, if you don't move them back, what do New Yorkers do? They ride right by them, therefore creating the conflict again. So this gives you an example of how on Govs Island, when we're thinking about design, we have a very messy process. And it's a very messy process on purpose because we're not only listening to our users, but we're really trying to understand what they're thinking, what they're doing, what they want, and then how do we build that in incrementally? And so in effect, what we have on the island, whether it's how high a seat bench should be or a particular sign, we are looking all the time at what people do, and that is reflected ultimately in our design process. So I'll conclude by saying sometimes the best design is beautiful, and I think our welcome wall will be beautiful and will be a great meeting place. And sometimes it doesn't look like design at all. But baked into both that welcome wall and that sign are literally hundreds and hundreds of hours of collaboration between us as the people who manage the site, the client in this process, the design team, and ultimately the users. Because even though the users weren't necessarily at the table, by our observing and respecting them and paying attention to how they moved in space, they ultimately were part of this process. So I hope that that has some relevance to how you think about design. I can say as a consumer of the healthcare system that as you think about what you're doing and the incredibly important work that you do, the more that you can think about what it's like sometimes to be in our shoes when we're your patient, I think that that is going to lead to really extraordinary innovation in the healthcare industry. Thank you.
Let me just say I am a huge fan of Govs Island. I live in Red Hook, so I see Govs Island outside my apartment window, and we go there every weekend.
I know, next weekend's your favorite weekend, John. It's the Vendy Awards.
I know, the Vendy Awards, yes. Which is...
street food.
The street food vendors go to Govs Island, and their food is judged, and they win these great awards, including there's like a humanitarian award for a vendor, which is named after the vendor who stopped the bombing in Times Square 3 years ago. And so every aspect of food is judged at the Vendy Awards. And you might think, oh, it's just this is a cutthroat, dramatic competition. It is, in fact, one of the hottest tickets in town to get on Govs Island. Yes, that's right. And New Yorkers are all foodies, so it's just one of the examples of the uses of Governors Island. Let's talk a little bit about the traditional way that something like Governors Island would be developed. There would just be a commercial, someone would make the decision, all right, we're going to put a casino there, and then they would say, all right, to do that, you got to have some hotels, and you got to have some residential stuff, and then the infrastructure sort of comes out of that, and then all the other decisions are made based on those initial decisions. How is this process different from a commercial process?
Well, it is a public space. So first of all, we have public obligations, and that goes without saying. In a sense, we had the advantage, well, A, we weren't allowed to put a casino on or to build residential housing, so that kind of wiped out the two obvious ways to make money and make it desirable. But really, when I started 6 years ago, I started from the premise that we had to get people there. And so we got people there by welcoming all kinds of wacky activities like street food competitions, unicycle festivals, and other kinds of programming that don't typically take place in public space and municipal parks in most cities in the country. And that's how we animated the place. And then, of course, at the same time, we said we needed to transform this island, this old dilapidated military base, by creating a really transformative destination park.
And what do you think in healthcare? And let me just preface this by saying you've worked with, you probably didn't work with a lot of designers at Microsoft, right?
I worked with a lot of designers, and we called them software engineers.
Software designers,
program
right.
managers.
But the designers that you worked with on this project, would you say that one of the core key skills of a designer is to certainly be curious and open and want to acquire knowledge, but on some level, designers find a way to talk about stuff they maybe don't know that much about?
What do you mean?
They're not experts, but they still have to talk about a subject. Designers are kind of that way, right?
It is interesting when you actually ban a lot of the typical words in design vocabulary because it actually forces people to then articulate their ideas and really make them clearer instead of using the jargon that kind of layers. But I would say we have an extraordinary design team. Adrian Hoyza, who's the lead designer, is one of the most talented people I've ever encountered, let alone had the privilege to learn from. And what I would say, it is truly a collaboration. I mean, he calls me the anthropologist on the team, that I'm always sort of pointing out how people might use the space and how to think about that. But he is a brilliant designer, and I was showing you kind of the most sort of utilitarian space in the park, but I can sort of suggest, you know, this is a problem, and then he'll come up with something that, of course, I couldn't imagine.
Great, and you can go to Governors Island and see the evidence of the just spectacular design work, and much, much more to come, as Leslie suggests. But let me hire you then to be a designer, anthropologist, what you will. What is the equivalent of being handed an island in the healthcare space? What would we call it? Would it be like Rhode Island, or would it be do it all through maybe the Mayo healthcare system? And what would be an island where you could create your own rules, really make the space what you want, unencumbered by the ongoing processes that, you know, for instance, determine how the FDR drive is going to, I mean, you have to be sensitive to the fact that people are going to use it. You can't stop them from using it. You don't often get handed a blank slate like that. What in healthcare do you think is the Governor's Island?
I'd actually turn that question around, and I think that actually every healthcare facility, in a sense, is like Governor's Island, because the iteration that goes on and the conversation that goes on can go on in every single facility. What is it that every member of your staff thinks? What does the janitor think? You know, have you actually asked your patients what was their experience of a process? What kinds of things can you do? I mean, the sign is a perfect example, right? That costs $300. Literally, you move the sign and behavior changes. And I think when you think about what causes stress for people, and if we use healthcare speaking, I'm only qualified to speak as a patient, you know, the check-in process causes a huge amount of stress. So by the time you get to see the doctor, because of how you've been treated in a typical doctor's office, because there wasn't attention to those things, that if you actually put yourself in the, you know, just as you talked about at the beginning when you talked about the difference between that chair and the other chair and how it made you feel, and if you'd been wheeled around in that other chair for an hour before you saw the doctor, you're coming into that experience in a totally different way.
So the check-in process and how you arrive at Governor's Island, the design of that ferry landing, are almost identical. in the sense that you ask the exact same question.
Absolutely.
Now, you know, people mostly did not have an experience of using Governors Island before this project began. And obviously, when all the stuff is set up, there's going to be a congratulatory party, and everyone's going to go, wow, didn't we do fabulously well, and it's really, really great, and then thousands of people are going to come, and years will go by. And then you'll have a body of New Yorkers with lots of opinions about what really should be done with Governors Island based on how I've used it and the wishes of, wouldn't it be great if? How do you build that information and those requests and complaints and user ideas into your dynamic process of what do we do now?
Right. Well, we've actually done that from the beginning because, again, we had the challenge that unlike typical public projects, nobody really cared about Governors Island. It was closed most of the year. And if you have to go through public process, we call them community boards in New York City, basically what happens is you show up, 20 people show up, they express a bunch of opinions, and you keep on going, but that doesn't really reflect what the people, you know, when was the last time you went to your community board meeting?
No, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
So what we did instead was we put the plan up, that whole site plan with all the images, in an old office at Governors Island. We turned it into an exhibit space, and we put out Post-it notes. And we actually made rubber stamps because we thought a lot of kids come to Governors Island. We thought, well, you know, they'll kind of, while their parents are looking at the exhibit. What we found is that if you invite adults, and we just went through this exercise a few minutes ago, to be creative, they actually are. So what we did is so they have rubber stamps, and people made kind of the equivalent of little haikus using the stamps and the markers. And then what we did was we actually coded all of those and created a word cloud. Because I think one of the challenges is for exercises like this is what is the feedback mechanism that I've done that? And did they do anything about it? Because nobody trusts government, right? So you gave us some ideas, what do we do? Now in our case, it was a little bit easier. People wanted ice cream, so we immediately turned around and got 3 ice cream vendors for the next summer. But we also really studied what they did, and every year we update it and we do the same thing. So that's the way that we have a channel, and it's a channel that's equal for everyone. And even our first year, about 1% of the people who stepped foot on the island actually wrote a meaningful Post-it note, which is actually an extraordinary percentage if you think about it. So we're always building in those input mechanisms.
Finally, what's going to happen to the military residential housing that exists on Governors Island?
Well, if you'd like to come out on Thursday, we'll be having a little demolition party. So the non-historic part of the island, there's a bunch of derelict buildings, so demolition starts at 11 a.m. on Thursday.
You're looking at me like, you think that's something that I'm really into, is demolition? What have you heard?
If I tell you that we may be able to implode a building, basically all of Rochester, Minnesota will get on a plane to come watch. So that's pretty much. But we are making progress, and that, again, one of, I think, the important things in any of these processes is, you know, we like to say we think big and act small, but that you actually report back to your constituents, whoever they are, about what you're doing, and that hopefully the proof is in the design. If this space works the way we hope it does, we've already seen signs of that, then people will understand that they were part of it, even if it wasn't on a particular Post-it note.
Leslie, thanks so much.
Thank you.